Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's my honor to welcome you to the event today, Colonized by Data, Resisting Capitalism's Emerging Social Order. I am fully confident that it's going to be a provocative and disturbing and hopefully mobilizing event today. I also especially want to welcome Naomi's class, who's here, and this is why we're starting, if you're wondering, some of you, why it's 1:10 exactly. So this is tied to our course schedules and the other classes as well. My name is Jack Bradich. I'm a faculty member in the Journalism and Media Studies Department at the School of Communication and Information. The School of Communication and Information, in partnership with the Institute for Women's Leadership and the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, is co-sponsoring this event, and it's part of an ongoing initiative, including and especially the Gloria Steinem Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies. So this event is part of a programmatic series of public events, which include panel discussions, interviews, and book launches. And one of the threads, there are a couple of threads in these series, but one of them is about the relationship of technology, society, and power. I think it's been prescient and it's really relevant given what we've been learning in the last couple of weeks about the MIT Media Lab and its relationship to funding from Jeffrey Epstein and others. So there's been an ongoing controversy in the last couple of weeks about technology, society, and power. But I want to just mention a couple of the recent events from last academic year, Women Confronting Big Tech, which involved the folks talking about the Google walkout and the complicity of tech companies with ICE. Another book launch, Empowered, Popular Feminism, Popular Misogyny by Sarah Benet Weiser, which was looking at online worlds as sites of antagonism around gendered power, both capitalist and patriarchal. And then I just want to mention one more dimension that's coming up, one of these events. On Monday, November 25th, the New Tech Resistance, a forum on tech worker organizing, so turning to labor as a question of technology, society, and power. Okay, so to move on, so I just want to say that, it was about 10 years ago when in this very building, I was walking up to this building, the Student Center, and there was a sign on the door that said, by entering this building, you are consenting to give up your images because MTV was filming inside this building that day in the Student Center. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Like, here you are, students paying tuition money for this place. Meanwhile, if you come in, you automatically grant MTV the right to make money off of your image, right? If you're captured in the background or whatever they were shooting that day. So that was a rudimentary form of this kind of data capture and questions around consent around that, and a kind of value extraction that was happening with images. But now these everyday activities can generate value for a media company. And in today's book, we will be examining more of this. The book, obviously called The Costs of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. Okay, as we'll hear in a couple of minutes, Nick Couldry and Ulises Mejías argue that today's transformation of social life through data must be grasped within the long historical arc of dispossession as both a new colonialism and an extension of capitalism. As a result, resistance requires challenging forms of coloniality that decolonial thinking has foregrounded for centuries. The struggle will require forms of solidarity that build connection on different terms from those currently on offer by these companies. So let me just introduce now our folks today before opening it up. So Nick Couldry is professor of media communications and social theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and from 2017 has been a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Along with Clemencia Rodriguez, he wrote the chapter on media and communications in the 2018 report of the International Panel on Social Progress. He's the author of numerous books, including The Mediated Construction of Reality with Andreas Hepp, Media, Society, World, Social Theory and Digital Media Practice, and Why Voice Matters. Ulises Alí Mejías is Associate Professor of Communication Studies and Director of the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York, Oswego. He is a media scholar whose work encompasses critical internet studies, network theory and science, philosophy and sociology of technology, and the political economy of digital media. He's the author of Off the Network, Disrupting the Digital World, the University of Minnesota Press, and various articles including Disinformation in the Media, The Case of Russia and Ukraine, and Liberation and the Arab Spring, From Utopia to Atopia and Beyond. He's the principal investigator in the Algorithm Observatory Project. Naomi Klein is the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University, an award-winning journalist, a New York Times best-selling author. She's also senior correspondent for The Intercept and a Puffin Writing Fellow at Type Media Center. Among her recent books, No Is Not Enough, Resisting the New Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need, and This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And her new book, which I think technically launches tomorrow, is called On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. And I know that Naomi has recently been talking a lot about this, including with Greta Thunberg last week in New York. Okay, so let me just tell you a bit about how the program's going to work, and then I will exit the stage. So first, Nick and Ulises will discuss their book for about 45 minutes. Then Naomi will join Nick and Ulises in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to question and answer session for hopefully 10 to 15 minutes. And then there'll be a book signing in the back of the room at the end. And so I know some of you have classes that you need to attend, and maybe in the middle of the talk around 2:30 or so. So I would ask you to please leave through the back so to cause minimal disruption. Okay, so enough for me. Let me please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guests today, Ulises Mejías and Nick Couldry.
Well, we're really thrilled to be here in Rutgers, and we're very grateful to Naomi and her team for inviting us into Naomi's class and also creating the opportunity where we can meet people from many other classes. It's very, very exciting for us. What we're going to do today is introduce you to the main argument of our book, which came out just 2 weeks ago, The Costs of Connection. And what we want to focus on for all of you is the core question of the book, which is basically very, very simple. What is going on with data? How should we make sense of all the new and maybe not so new developments around data across business and government, society, and life, human life itself, our lives, each one of us? How do we make sense of the whole thing that's going on? Well, of course, as you know, there are many ideas already on the table, and most of them have focused so far on capitalism, claiming this is a new capitalism in some sort of way. Digital capitalism, informational, platform capitalism, that's a little bit more specific and precise. Most famously, surveillance capitalism, by Shoshana Zuboff's book, came out earlier this year. Very inspiring, her work to us from the very beginnings of our work on this book. Also, data capitalism. Those are obviously very major contributions. We don't doubt that for a moment. We learn a lot from them. But the question we want to ask and share with you today is there something even bigger going on with data that holds the whole thing together? Is it possible, as we propose in the book, that something's going on that really does amount not just to yet another development in the capitalism none of us know how to think beyond, which in a sense is a news, but actually something truly history-changing, an epoch-changing moment? Could it be that we're entering now, and what's confusing us so much now, is a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. Relations which I'm sure I don't need to remind you have been evolving not just for 30, 40 years, but for 500 years. Because if it hadn't been for the first 2 centuries of colonialism, capitalism would never have got going. An uncomfortable truth that the pioneers of capitalism don't always want to remind us of, but it's a basic truth of history. And we get hints that there might be something colonial going on with data in business cliches today. So that's a familiar one from the front page of The Economist a few years ago. Data is the new oil. Oil obviously has colonial implications. That's pretty clear. But many people would say that's just a harmless business metaphor. You can deconstruct it if you're an academic, but it doesn't really matter that much. It's just a turn of phrase. Or is this very phrase, data is the new oil, as we argue in the book, precisely the ideology that covers up a major new phase of resource appropriation, telling us the data, it's just there, let's make use of it, rather than reminding us, hey, something has actually been extracted from you so that data can just be there. So this is a core point. And this colonial reading of what's going on with data actually didn't start with us. It's certainly not the orthodox reading, but the suggestion emerged in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which I'm sure you all heard about last March. Christopher Wiley, who was the Edward Snowden of that scandal, said a few weeks in, when he was asked to comment on Cambridge Analytica's plans at that time, they're now bankrupt, of course, to expand their nefarious operations in India, he said, "This is what modern colonialism looks like." But our question is, what does that actually mean?
Okay, so central point in our argument is really that what we are experiencing is an emerging reality, not just a metaphor. When we say data colonialism, we're really not just using the term as a metaphor, and we're going to be very specific about that. What we're seeing is this genuinely new phase of colonialism, which we call data colonialism, that in time will prepare the ground for a new model of capitalist production. In similar ways in which the first colonialism, historical colonialism, as Nick just mentioned, prepared the ground for industrial capitalism. Of course, this will happen while coexisting with the legacy of colonialism, with historical colonialism and its neo-colonial legacy, with the inequalities that we still face today. But of course, this is a sensitive term to use, and we want to be very careful about using it. Are we arguing that this new form of colonialism matches the violence, matches the mayhem of historical colonialism? We're saying no, it does not. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, but there are continuities that should alarm us, and that's what our argument is about. So let me give you a definition of data colonialism. We basically say it is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. That's how we define it. And so to make sense of this definition, we also need to think a little bit about the difference between colonialism and coloniality. And here we rely on the work of a Peruvian sociologist, Aníbal Quijano, who sort of defined what coloniality is. Colonialism, we could say, is over. Yes, nations got their independence. They're no longer colonies. But the legacy of colonialism continues. That's what Quijano was trying to argue. So coloniality refers to this heritage, to the fact that even today we cannot understand the world, we cannot understand its politics, its social phenomena, without thinking about what happened during 500 years of colonialism. So what we argue, in fact, is that while the modes, the intensities, the scales, and the context of colonialism are different, the function remains the same, and that function is to dispossess.
But we want to be really direct with you. So we recognize that this colonial framing of what's going on with data is provocative. It's designed to be provocative, to shock us into thinking. It also, to some of you, may seem counterintuitive. Just does not make sense. So what we want to do right away is anticipate the conclusion of the book, what comes out to us from spending 3 years writing it, and get down to the core question, which is, what do we gain from understanding what's going on with data through this colonial perspective? And there are basically two types of advantage. The first type of advantage affects, if you like, the lens, how wide our lens can be to understand everything that's going on with data. If we think about this in terms of colonialism, this totally changes the time scale on which we think. We are talking about the past 500 years of history, not just the exciting, heady developments of the last 4 decades, let alone the last 15 years of social media, let alone the last 5 years of intense data extraction, Internet of Things. We're looking at the long durée of history. And in that longer context, we can see data as a new form of taking resource, the world's finite resources, and using a new sort of resource for extraction of economic value, for the benefit of capitalism. And also that changes how we think about forward as well. We're not just talking about what is the new stage of capitalism right now today. We're looking about the new capitalism that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decades in the future can be built on the base of this resource grab right now, the grabbing of data. Because that's what happened when colonialism emerged. Suddenly it became possible for European powers to realize the whole of the Earth's resources were there just for them, for the taking. And we're going to come back to that. But it was only out of that over 50 to 100 to 200 years, the starting points of capitalism became possible. So we're looking back into the past and much further forward into the future. A colonial perspective also encourages to look very broadly at the range of things going on with data. We talk mainly about the scandals with social media, and for good reason. But there's a lot of other important things connected with them that are also going on. So we can look at the spread of surveillance, extremely intense forms of surveillance, in many forms of workplace, such as the Amazon warehouse floor. Surveillance that could never have been imagined in its intensity until now, until data processes. We can look at the gig economy, the recent rise of awareness about the exploitation that Uber and Lyft represent, but many other types of gig economy too. Logistics. Logistics are fine because you want your packages or books to arrive on time. They're not fine when you are the worker moving from point to point through every hour of the day, every moment of every day, being tracked so that the logistics can work. Internal corporate data sounds innocent, but it's important to remember when we concentrate on social media platforms that IBM, who were the part of big tech, who were accused of missing the bus, missing out on social media platforms, in one of their annual reports 2 or 3 years ago, they said, we're not worried. 80% of the important data is internal to corporations. That's what we're focusing on. But internal is an interesting word. When you get a smart fridge or a smart toaster, data about your life, how often you use the toaster, what you put in your fridge, how often you shut the door or whatever, how often you restock it, that's your data, your life, as it were. But that suddenly becomes internal data to the maker of the toaster or the fridge simply through the operation of the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things is a key pivot to change our lives into internal corporate data, which is the bigger transformation going on. But this new colonialism is complex. It's not exactly the same as the first colonialism. Of course not. This new colonialism is both external and internal. It has to be internal because if it's human life that's being appropriated, human life is everywhere, including in America, including in the richest countries, Britain, Germany, Brazil, China, everywhere. It's everywhere. So it has to be internal, and at the very same time, patterns are clearly emerging of global dominance in the power to extract this. In America and China, and in a replay in the sense of the early colonialism where Spain and Portugal initially fought it out, we now have America versus China. But this time on a fully global scale, which wasn't clear in the very beginnings of colonialism. So that's how this broadens our scope of thinking. But another impact of a colonial frame is to change our sensitivity to the long-term consequences of this resource grab of our lives in the form of data. We argue in the book that none of this would be effective beyond the dreams of business people, beyond certain ideologies about what must happen, if it wasn't something we ourselves, each one of us, was directly complicit in every day, every moment of our lives. We are helping to build a new social order based around the extraction of data. And this order is a form of interdependence. We're all becoming more dependent on certain devices, machines, things operating, which in turn depend on extracting data from us and ruling us, governing us in certain ways. This is the new social order that we have to get our heads around to understand the full force of the changes that are underway today. There's another final advantage in a colonial approach, which came out in what Ulises said before when he mentioned the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. One of the realizations we had in writing the book, getting towards the end of it, was that there was an even deeper colonial aspect to everything we've written so far, which was that the very idea of the rationality that we must have more data. You can't run a business anymore without a data model, grabbing the data from every aspect of every process that feeds into that business and managing it, managing your workers so that that data is fueled and used appropriately. That idea of the exclusive use of one type of reason or knowledge is the latest version of the West's idea that it itself has a special take on rationality, that it itself has a special claim on how to do things rationally. If we contest it, we enter a certain double consciousness. We say our lives are one way, they feel one way, they're not about data, and yet we are told they are about data and the organizing of life so that data can be extracted. It's only within a colonial frame that we can draw on the great insights of decolonial thinkers about how power and knowledge have always worked together in the history of modernity and in the history of colonialism, and the two always operating together. Now let's look in a little bit more detail about how we get trapped in this. How does this happen? How is the social order built? Our argument in the book is this happens through data relations. Relations in our lives that are configured precisely to optimize the extraction of data for economic value. That sounds banal, but actually it's a very major theoretical step. Because if you remember Marx's key theory of how to understand capitalism as a social order is that it's made possible through labor relations. Ordinary everyday activities, ways of making stuff, forms of creativity become commodified so that labor can be exchanged on a labor market for money so that people can live. Labor relations are the core to Marx's model of how a social order of capitalism is possible at all. Without it, you can't have capitalism. And that clearly remains true. But what we're seeing today is something that forces us to extend Marx's model. If Marx were right, we couldn't understand what's going on with data when we just hang out with our friends, send pictures to our friends. Yesterday we had a family birthday party in my family. We sent pictures across the Atlantic. It was thrilling for me. I was not working when I did that. I was the opposite of working. I was being with my family, the people that matter most to me. That was not work. I know that. And yet, data was being extracted precisely in that process. That is a massive extension of the possibilities of capital's power over human life. And we get help for thinking about this from Moshe Postone, who died last year, a great Marxist theorist who insisted that we need to be creative with Marx thinking. Rather than just saying capitalism is only and can only ever be about labor relations, he said that the core of Marx's theory of labor relations is commodification, the commodifying of work so that it can be exchanged on the market. And even more than that, there's a deeper core. You can only have commodification if you abstract. What is data? But an abstraction from the flow of human life. That is its core feature. Is it possible, therefore, that Marx, if he were alive today, would see this is a new universe of extraction, a new universe of building an order of capitalism, no longer just through labor relations, but through a radical new form of relations, which we call data relations, that configure stuff and flows of life so that data can be abstracted. Because if that's true, then ordinary social life, just hanging out, doing what human beings should always be doing, connecting, having fun, supporting each other, become in themselves a direct input to production. Marx would have called it a factor of production. If that's true, then human life itself is becoming annexed to capitalism. Nothing in between, directly plugged in. And if that's true, then the monitoring of our daily lives surely, and we'll come back to this, threatens our possibilities for freedom. We'll come back to that. Just a little bit more about these data relations. We know this spiral. We're in it all the time. We can't get out of it. Every time we accept an app on our phone, accept the terms and conditions of data extraction, every time we want to join a new platform, we accept the terms. Every time we get a smart appliance, we have a little choice but to accept the terms. Why? Because we want that appliance to work. No one wants a fridge that doesn't work. It has to work. Therefore, we have to accept. So that spiral, although made of thousands of individual decisions, is a vortex. It's almost impossible to escape, though sometimes we dream of escaping from it. And from that, there's a really fundamental point emerges. If we go back to the original colonialism, 500 years ago, that was a time when part of the planet wanted to grab the resources of the whole of the planet, but it had to do so on the basis of absolutely no social relations whatsoever. Therefore, there were only two ways of grabbing the gold and the silver, either through sheer physical violence or through lying. And there was a lot of both. Until new social relations were built that created what we recognize now, looking back, as colonial reality. But at the beginning, there was only two options: violence and deception. That's not the case with the new colonialism. The new colonialism can base on 2 centuries of capitalist social relations. We're all pretty practiced in signing contracts, fulfilling terms and conditions, signing and doing whatever we have to fulfill a contract, fulfill what capitalism expects of us. That means that right now, to have an epochal change in the relations of human to capital, violence is not needed. It may become common, but it is precisely not needed right now, and that means we're at a very different moment in history. So the fact there's no violence with data colonialism should not shock us, it should not surprise us. It's exactly what we would expect on this model. Let me say a little bit more, though, about that point about freedom that I mentioned before. In chapter 5 of the book, as the beginnings of the turn in the book to thinking about how we could resist this new order that's being built, we ask the question, are there any philosophical resources out there that could help us begin to think a way out of this box, a way out of this trap that humanity seems to have fallen into? And there we look at a key concept which has always been useful, which is the concept of freedom. Not just privacy, that's too detailed. The basic idea that human beings are free beings. Is there a philosophical account of freedom that can help us think our way out of the problems of data colonialism? Well, for one thing, liberal notions of freedom, freedom to trade yourself on the market, are not going to help. They're exactly going to draw you into the vortex. They're exactly the wrong notion of freedom to draw on. We need a very different socially based notion of freedom, what philosophers call a relational notion of freedom. The idea that my freedom only exists in the set of relations in which you are also free, and I recognize your freedom. And for detail, we actually have to go even further and look at a philosopher who is certainly problematic in this context. Georg Hegel, from the early 19th century, one of the philosophers who bears some responsibility for advocating the continuation of colonialism. But he was a complex thinker. And he also offered one of the smartest definitions of this relational notion of freedom. In fact, the very first one that any philosopher ever developed. He argued that freedom is the freedom to be with oneself in the other. In short, the in the other is all the relations that make me have the possibility of feeling free. But in saying this, he said something astonishingly useful to today. He said, of course, freedom means the freedom to be with oneself. The idea that when I'm communing, do I love this person or not? Am I afraid to die? There's nothing else that can come between me and that. No system can be tracking me. It's just me confronting the realities of my life. That is what freedom is. The amazing thing is that 200 years ago, he could never have dreamt that they would be under threat. Except, as he mentions in a footnote, in the case of slavery. He was at least aware enough to notice that. But in general terms, it could not be challenged. We are living in a period where precisely that basic freedom potentially is under threat. And we find parallels between that thinking and a great Mexican-Argentinian philosopher, Enrique Dussel, who developed the philosophy of liberation. His philosophy was developed against the West, to challenge Western power. But where is it based? Where is its core? The idea is, as he puts it, of the natural substantivity of the self. The idea that to be a self, there has to be that bounded space where I and nothing else, no other self can come in between. That is what freedom is based on. But if, through continuously being tracked, through Fitbit, workplace devices, insurance trackers in our cars, and so on and so forth. If I'm being tracked at every moment of every day, we argue in the book, I am no longer with myself. There's something in between. Okay, you say, fine. But let's remember the philosophy. If that's true, if I can no longer be with myself without an external system intervening, according to these philosophical ideas, I'm no longer a self at all. It may take a while to realize that. But it's the very possibility of freedom that is at stake here. Surveillance, self-tracking, or the algorithms designed to manage behavior in the workplace and beyond, marketers and so on, are eroding what we call in the book the minimal integrity of the self as a self. We're becoming dependent on external data to tell us who we are, tell us what we're feeling. Marketers often say they know our feelings better than we know them ourselves. For them, that's just a cliche, but it cuts at the very basis of notions of freedom throughout human history. So, just as historic colonialism came to have profound implications for human subjects at the very deepest level, so too we're saying with data colonialism. But again, as with historic colonialism, this is going to roll out in a very, very uneven way. If you're on the Amazon warehouse floor, your options for negotiating its terms of tracking you are not the same as Jeff Bezos's negotiations with his shareholders. He's tracked in a very different way from the workers who work for him. And that goes right through society. So it's quite possible, and in fact it's likely, that the inequalities of data colonialism will work in a way to reinforce the deep inequalities that are the legacy of historic colonialism and capitalism.
Okay, so we've sort of presented to you some of the building blocks of our argument. And you might be wondering, so why do we allow this to happen, right? Why is it so hard to resist this new model? And part of the reason we argue that is the case is because even though we're talking about new developments, the ideologies on which this is built are old. They come from the past. So we're going to review some of them. For instance, we have economic rationalities, economic ways of thinking that justify what is happening. Here, I think we've seen a very clear progression, unfortunately, from cheap nature to cheap labor to cheap data. So think about what the colonialists had to do to conceptualize the world in terms of nature being cheap, which means it was freely available. It was there just as a resource that could be appropriated. And then, of course, the labor to process all of those resources had also to be acquired. And so this rationality, even based on race, of who is available to do all of that work, entered into place. And so then we have cheap labor. And so now, of course, we have cheap data. The idea that data is also a similar kind of exhaust. It's just there for the taking. We also have certain kinds of technological rationalities. The idea, right, in the back of our head that tells us that more data and smarter technologies are always best. So we have a very clear linear progression or understanding of progress. All of this is unfolding because that's what progress is. We cannot be stopped. And the more of these technologies we have, the better society is as a whole. Legally, we also have a whole set of ways of rationalizing what is happening. Even if we go back to the concept of terra nullius, which basically means no man's land. The idea that all of these resources, like I just mentioned, were just there for the taking, and so the colonialists were able to enter all of these spaces, acquire all of these resources because they didn't belong to anybody. The people who were there were not even conceptualized as fully human beings. So we could just appropriate all of that. And then, of course, we have epistemological rationalities. Sorry, this remote is very sensitive. And so here we have to go back to Aníbal Quijano and his critique of the Western universal rationality. This ideology which basically obliterates difference. So colonialists were very much interested in constructing a world where every single thing would be aligned to their ideology. And if it didn't, if it resisted, it could just be destroyed. What we want instead, of course, is a rationale that requires the recovery of all of those alternative rationalities, which are based on precisely our respect for difference. And so if you think, for instance, of the civilizational mission of colonialism, the idea that we were told, or colonial subjects were told, that all of this is happening for your own benefit. It's happening for your own good. We want to resist that. Who is behind all of this? Who are the players that are actually involved in this process? In the book, we also just didn't want to say internet companies or Silicon Valley. We wanted to come up with a comprehensive label for what is happening. And so we call it the social quantification sector. The social quantification sector is basically this industry sector devoted to the development of all of this infrastructure required for extraction that we have been talking about. Yes, we do have the big players. We do have Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, as well as their counterparts in China, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi. So remember, we're encountering a bipolar world order where the US and China are competing for the extraction of these resources. So we are talking about those big companies. What's interesting also is to remember that these companies are acting as monopoly-monopsony hybrids. And so, of course, you know, a monopoly, it's a market structure in which you only have a single seller. A monopsony is also a term from economics, which basically means a market structure characterized by a single buyer. So all of us are media producers. All of us create videos and tweets, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want that video of your cat doing something very funny, if you want it to be seen by a lot of people, where are you going to upload it? YouTube, right? There are other options, there are other platforms, but if you really want that video to be seen by as many people as possible and your friends, you're going to put it on YouTube. So that's what we mean by a monopsony, a single buyer, that we create all of this media, but at the end of the day, there are very few corporations that are buying our content. And of course, you know, when you have monopolies and monopsonies, what happens is that those corporations can set prices. A monopoly can raise prices, set the price as high as they want. A monopsony can set the price as low as they want. So in both instances, it can be dangerous. Here again, we find an echo to colonialism, where companies like the East India Company also acted as monopsonies. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something we're encountering for the first time in history. If you were a producer of the poppy plant in India, which the East India Company used to generate opium, you could only sell that resource to the East India Company. So it was acting as a monopsony. And of course, we have other players of different sizes. So the big ones are important, and we should analyze them. But if you think of any hardware manufacturer of a smart device, a device that is somehow connected to the internet and thus involved in this process of extraction, that would be part of the social quantification sector. Software companies developing the software required for all of these operations. Platform companies, yes, we've already mentioned Facebook, but of course all the other ones, Netflix and Uber, as well as data analytics and data brokerage companies. The companies that extract the data and package it and sell it to different buyers. So this is about everything. This is not just about surveillance. That's what we were trying to suggest by coming up with this comprehensive term of the social quantification sector. Now let me give you some examples from history. So let's talk more specifically about this coloniality of data relations. And in the book, what we do is to analyze the full import of extraction. We borrow from strategy video games the 4X model, which maybe you've heard about. And of course, you can see here, this is actually from Sid Meier's Civilization. He actually had a title on colonialism. This is the colonialist video game in which you can play, I think, the British, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French. And so, of course, the natives and the lands are controlled by the computer. They are there just for appropriation. And in this kind of game, this 4X strategy that I mentioned, basically the 4X strategy involves explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. Thank you. So I'm just going to give you some quick examples of what we mean by those. Let's start with explore. This might be kind of small for you to read, but this is part of the terms of service of Google Chrome, the language that when you installed Google Chrome, you had to accept. And so as you can see there, it says you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or displayed on or through the services. It's pretty comprehensive, yeah? So in the book, what we try to do is find these transhistorical moments. And one of the documents that we compare this to is a document called the Requerimiento. Now, this is a document that the Spanish conquistadors would arrive at a village in what is now Latin America, and sometimes in the middle of the night, and stand outside the village and read this document in Spanish to a non-Spanish speaking audience. Here's a little excerpt of what that document said. It's pretty interesting. It says, if you do not submit, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. And as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods, and shall do all of the mischief and damage that we can. Spanish Requerimiento, 1513, accept and install. So I think the comparison here is interesting in terms of just the incomprehensibility of the language. Yes, something that the Spaniards were reading to a population that could not even understand it, not just in terms of the language, but just the rationale behind it, to perform this trick of dispossession, which apparently today we continue to perform when we click accept and install.
So that's the explore the land grabber resource, which is the fundamental stage of the data colonialism game. Let's skip expansion. Let's assume that's going on. We've given you lots of evidence of that. Internet of Things is a core terrain of expansion. Let's move to exploit. So exploitation goes on in many workplaces. Exploitation is a form of using resource to the maximum with the law, within the law. And right now, there's a battle going on as to what laws should apply to data. A massive battle. In fact, Facebook and Microsoft are even asking to be regulated, presumably because they want a certain type of law, not another. There's a massive battle going on about how data, what is going on with data, should be regulated. What should be the law? Now, interestingly, exactly the same thing happened in the early decades of historical colonialism. The idea was to grab the gold and the silver, but if possible, to do it legally, as you just heard with the requerimiento. The problem was how to justify this. This was not easy. It wasn't easy to come up with a legal justification. And we get a remarkable insight into the underlying logic of how a legal justification emerged from a writer, a rather scandalous writer, Carl Schmitt, the German political theorist, who, looking back as a Nazi on what went wrong in losing the great colonial order which he was so sad to lose, he went back to the beginning and gave us a wonderful interpretation of it in 1950. He said that it was the Conqueror's Scientific Cartographic Survey that was the true title, because it embodied a superior rationality. It generated a totally new type of legal title, effective occupation. And then, as he explains, European discovery of a new world in the 15th and 16th centuries did not occur by chance, but the reason it didn't occur by chance, he offers, is truly mind-blowing. It's in the final sentence there. The intellectual advantage was entirely on the European side, so much so the new world could just be taken. He's saying two things here. First of all, that might becomes right, not just on its own by true force, but when combined with the law. So how does the law acquire this capacity to reinforce violence? Well, it happens when the law emerges to justify something that was previously outside the law in accordance with a higher rationality. And that is exactly what is happening with the rationality of big data today.
Okay, and before we conclude, I just want to touch briefly on the point about extermination. Because like we already mentioned, it's not about the violence. It's not about, 90% of the population of the American continent being decimated, as actually happened during colonialism. We argue that what data colonialism exterminates are alternative ways of thinking and alternative ways of being. So in other words, it's the mind that is being colonized, not just the body. It is the mind that is a vulnerable site of colonization. And if you think about, for instance, the argument by Ashish Nandy, his book that he calls The Intimate Enemy, the idea that this rationale is entrenched deep inside our minds. But let me just kind of, by way of conclusion, quickly ask, how do we resist? What are we suggesting can be done about all of this? Firstly, I think we need to realize that we're talking about two levels of colonization, as Nick pointed out earlier. We have external colonization, which happens with creating this bipolar capitalist world, the United States and China, fighting it out in the land grab for new resources. And then we also have internal colonization. So the idea that this algorithmic discrimination is also happening within national borders at each one of these sites. Here, perhaps we could look at the work of Frantz Fanon, who sort of theorized a whole psychopathology of the colonized subject, by arguing that the colonized subject developed very specific kinds of neuroses. So yes, colonialism creates its own kind of its own neuroses, and so maybe if we start thinking about the anxiety, the depression, everything that's going on at the cognitive level, we can similarly start thinking about a psychopathology of data colonialism. We have to also remember that people, corporations, and governments have very different stakes in this new order, yes? So that one-track approach is not going to work. We have to care about deregulation. We have to work to put pressure on governments so that they can regulate this whole social quantification sector, which is basically unregulated. And maybe we can even consider more individual options, such as opting out. I'm not on Facebook. I feel very sanctimonious about it. But I have to use Google, because that's what my school uses even for emails. So these kinds of opting out, very boutique kinds of activism are not going to be enough. They will not work just by themselves. We have to realize that individual subjects are also very differently positioned, precisely because this whole earlier heritage of colonialism is still with us, hasn't gone away, so that racial, class, and economic differences are reproduced through data relations, perhaps even more opaquely or effectively than before. As far as concrete suggestions, we think that, for instance, colonized space and time need to be reclaimed. We need to recuperate this idea that our space and time are not just empty and available for extraction. And we have to think about, or basically reject this universal rationality of data collection and extraction. We have to think more about seamfulness, not seamlessness. And here the work of Jeanette Vert is important, where she argues that instead of the seamless movement of data, we should really be caring about the accountability of those affected by the data. And lastly, yes, we have to learn from past and present decolonization struggles. Yeah, because some people have a lot of experience encountering these forces, and so we need to learn from them and listen to them. We need to reimagine forms of collectivity. We need to learn from them about technological appropriation, using tools but changing their function, creating common knowledge, and creating solidarity. And I know solidarity is a complicated term to end on. We're not just romanticizing it and suggesting we can all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and this will go away. There's going to be differences in approaches, and that's a good thing. It's not just okay, it's actually valuable, because after all, social movements are rarely unified. So we need to celebrate that diversity. And we need to basically think about solidarity more in terms of developing the shared understanding of how data is appropriating human life and the cost of doing nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such a stimulating presentation. Jack, thank you for the welcome, and all of you for coming here. There's been a tremendous amount of interest in this talk. I've only been at Rutgers for a year, starting my second year, but I know enough to know that it is hard to get this type of turnout in the middle of the day on a Monday, so I think it really shows the level of interest in this subject, as well as in your previous work. So I wanted to start off by asking you to elaborate a little bit on where you see this analysis fitting into the history of enclosing of the commons. Because obviously that's interrelated with colonialism, but not, it isn't exclusively a colonial framework that helps us understand the ways in which non-market space gets appropriated into the market. So one of the things that our class is looking at is looking at this stage of enveloping all of human life into the market within a history of enclosing the commons.
Well, that is an important perspective. Is this on? You hearing me okay? Good. That emerged as capitalism was getting going, particularly in Britain in the 17th century and so on. the acquisition of land that was already potentially a commodity of some sort. It was clearly land, it was ready to be used, but it was held in common. And so the ownership structure was challenged. It needed to be held by particular private people for exploitation. So that shift was important, but it was not the fundamental shift of the very idea that land could be owned at all. Whereas the initial colonial moment, the idea that was just the world was there to be exploited, really was the world-changing moment, because then the world became there for exploitation. So we see the commons, that will be an important part in the history of Western capitalism, and it had many variations in other parts of the world, but we'd see that as a sub-stage, if you like, compared with the fundamental world historical moment, which is when, hey, we can take everything. And that's the sort of moment we think we're in now. But there's a lot of overlapping, of course, and it's always both about colonialism and capitalism, so you can never easily separate one from the other. That's my first reaction.
Yeah, well, I would just add, and I kind of glanced over that slide on extermination, but in the book we actually borrow from your work, Naomi, and in terms of colonialism, creating these sacrifice zones, these areas where, you know, rules don't apply and basically they just exist for extraction. And so to us, you know, that's very much related to this kind of extermination that data colonialism carries out. And we basically think of them as, you know, a transition where, whereas before the economy was part of society, now society is kind of like a subset of the economy. So, you know, creating these enclosures, we are completely market-driven, are very direct ways of exterminating, ways of thinking and of being today.
And the other point that I find myself thinking about, and I know you have as well, is this: how do we parse that we're talking about something new, which is the appropriation of all of human life, right? And the fact that, of course, that isn't new in the sense that the ultimate appropriation of human life is slavery itself. So how does that fit in?
Yeah. You want to go first?
Well, that is a big, important topic in the book. And one thing we resisted from the beginning, although some people have flirted with this, will be suggesting in any way that what's happening with data, the loss of freedom, is a form of slavery. Because it's offensive to use that word that represented one of the most horrendous periods of organized violence against human beings in any other context than its original one. So we refuse to use that word. However, it's really important to remember, and this was forgotten by a long history, a lot of Marxist criticism, until the correctives emerged with Eric Williams and others, was to forget that slavery itself was a very important part of the reproduction of capitalism in the 19th century. The slave plantations in southern parts of the United States were essential to the fueling of the whole American economy. That's often not talked about, but even more, and we discovered this from a marvelous book called Slavery is Capitalism by some American historians that came out as we were writing the book, that even the very idea of accounting and the rationalized processing of units of human productivity, a lot of that emerged on the slave plantation itself. A lot of the big advances happened there. So one certainly can't separate capitalism from slavery, and there's a dark history that needs to be remembered. But for us, where that leads is to reinforce the idea that it's never enough just to study the history of capitalism, as if this was somehow cut off from all these other historic forms of violence that, as Marx said, lie in the prehistory of capitalism, primitive accumulation. Get them out of the way, and maybe capitalism can be a bit more rational, a little bit more humanistic, and so on. Oh no, the two have been linked all the way through, and so for us, therefore, that's the reason why it's no surprise that a new colonialism could emerge off the back of the old capitalism. But that means we're shifting from seeing this as a colonialism, the initial colonialism with its profound reliance on slavery, as if you like the initial push that got the capitalism engine started and then falls away because it's no longer needed, even though that wasn't true because it continued for a lot of time, but saying, what if we see the whole thing as a bigger dialectic, that colonialism and capitalism work together, which means they could enter a new cycle right now where a new colonial moment occurs that will prepare a way for a new capitalism. It doesn't need slavery, as I said, because we don't need the same violence because we're already in the system, but it could lead to profound challenges to human freedom, as we were trying to suggest. So there are relations, but they're not exactly analogous with slavery, and they fit within this bigger model we're trying to build of the dialectic between colonialism and capitalism.
Yeah, Nick, I think, said everything I wanted to say, except anecdotally, I would point out, for instance, when I have these conversations with my students, they usually think of colonialism and capitalism as two distinct epochs. And so they think of plantations, they happen, and then they ended, and then factories happened. And, we spent some time talking about how actually for a very long time the two coexisted, and actually plantations financed the factories. So I think, it's very important to keep in mind that, yes, this level of appropriation, there's certain brutality that came with colonialism, then allowed capitalism to emerge and succeed.
Yeah, and indeed, we could argue that it's all coexisting right now. If we think about the level of violence going on in the Brazilian Amazon right now to appropriate land from indigenous people, it's not like there are these neat phases and then we tuck it away. Or even when you're talking about cheap, the cheap land, cheap labor, cheap data, or cheap nature. I mean, we could argue that these tech companies simultaneously exploit all three and more, right? In terms of their use of energy and their use of cheap labor in processing the data, and we find out more and more about this daily. And then, of course, the cheap data itself. So, I mean, we hear this phrase a fair bit, like that you're not the user, you're the product. Would it be correct to say that within your analysis, what you're saying is maybe you're not the product, you're the frontier, that you are the site of extraction, or you are the mine site? How should we think of ourselves within this economy of extraction?
That's an interesting way of putting it, that phrase, you're not the user, you're a product, has almost become a cliche, and people don't mind necessarily being products, they like to produce. It's a sort of comfortable metaphor. And so it's just, we don't think about it. Whereas what we're saying is that it is something more than that, that if you like, that open space, which is your life, the totally open space that you're going to go on living until you die, all those possibilities you can't yet imagine, seamless, all of that is the domain of abstraction. It sounds a very harsh thing to say, but I would just recommend looking at some documents where marketers talk to other marketers about what their strategies are for the future. They're not, for example, just stopping with Fitbit, which they hope you're aware. They're interested in implants. Increasingly, there's a lot of marketing speculation about implants, building implants in beneath the skin so that when you are sweating, they already know and they will offer you cheap water around the corner based on the marketing data they've already got. This is the way marketers are thinking. So I think it's more than just a product. It is literally a domain of extraction. And I don't need to emphasize the violence that involves in converting the openness of human life into something, a space for abstraction. That is a violence that needs to be thought of on a world historical scale. And it does therefore fit in with Hegel's view about what has to be protected. And interestingly, I put up that quote from Hegel, which is a brilliant summary of what freedom is. As I said in his footnote, he said the one person on the planet who is not free is the slave, because they cannot be with themselves. The violence on them is so extreme. They are pushed down, so they cannot feel free. Of course, in the end, there was resistance. People proved him wrong. But he wasn't wrong in his sense of what was at stake in slavery, even though he celebrated colonialism in other ways. It makes him an interesting figure, if you like.
And you're right that I think this is very clear when we talk about the Internet of Things as really pushing that frontier, because that's where, this whole process of data extraction is reaching out to further and further to new spaces. And that's why also at the end we talk about decolonizing space and time, to the extent that now, digital assistants enter our kitchens and our bedrooms, and our phones are always with us, and we use them throughout the day. So very much, I think, in line with what you're saying about us being sort of like the frontier between this world where extraction happens continuously.
I mean, I'll be really interested to hear from the students in the room about who relates to this definition of freedom and who doesn't, because I think that the experience of unmediated freedom that you're describing is so scarce that I'm not even sure that it's clear. It's actually a skill you have to practice if you haven't practiced it. Shoshana Zuboff, when I spoke to her last year, she emphasized this idea that you have the right. What is the phrase she used? Do you remember, Nicole? You have the right not to hide within your own life, right? Because I think that a lot of young people are really skilled at sort of hiding their tracks and having fake Instagram accounts and sort of faking out the various watchers and miners of data. But that's different than not having to mask one's behaviors because you are genuinely free, right? According to the definition that you're putting out there. But I'm not sure that that's something that anybody takes for granted anymore.
Yeah, and in the book, especially in the end, where we're suggesting some strategies perhaps, we do also talk a lot about imagination, because I think it is that creative work to reimagine your relationships, and you're right, in this day and age, it does take a fair amount of effort to position our lives beyond this neo-extractivism. But imagination and creativity have always been fundamental components of any movement of decolonization, because sometimes people haven't been able to resist with their bodies, and sometimes they've only been able to resist with their minds. So that space, I think, of imagination is very important.
But I think that is a really important point, because we don't underestimate for a moment how difficult this can be, particularly for those who are younger than us. Who have grown up in this era, constantly being tracked and so on. But what we're saying is that we need to recover that older way of thinking, and therefore solidarity is partly solidarity across generations. But it's also a matter of remembering a different type of solidarity. So yes, we might be pretty skilled at covering our tracks on social media, the platforms we're familiar with. That's not the same as being skilled at covering your tracks in a workplace. How many people are skilled at that? How many people hold their jobs if they are skilled at that? That's the bigger pattern. That's why we insist on the bigger pattern. That's the bigger form of tracking going on. So the question is not whether you feel free or not because you're clever to obfuscate yourself on a particular platform. The question is, if this is the whole of your life everywhere, and that is the trend, would that be freedom or not? And our suggestion is it would not be freedom, and we all know that very well. So we have to get real and start to see the direction of travel, which means recovering memory of the period when we were less tracked than we are today.
And I think when we look at a more repressive government like China, it's easier to see that, okay, these technologies, these same extractive and surveillance technologies are being used to, track dissidents, to arrest them, to locate them, and so on. And it's like, okay, that is repression. We understand that. But when it's used to just track, who likes what kind of footwear, it feels like the stakes are a lot lower. So I would love to hear you speak a little bit more about what you see as the genuine stakes here.
Okay, well, in China is very important to this book, because until about 5 years ago, most of the debate was going on about what was going wrong with Silicon Valley, internal dialogue within the West. But actually, more and more, we're realizing there's a parallel form of this, which is in China. They want to lead AI by 2030 in the world. And if you look at the documents of the Chinese government, they're extremely interesting when they justify their expansion of AI, the famous social credit system, and so on. We were talking a lot earlier about social order. Well, we probably all think there's a big difference between the social order in China and the one here, and there is. But what's really striking when you look at how the Chinese government justifies what it's doing is its honesty. They don't hide the fact. They don't pretend they're building social media platforms for freedom, to help humanity. Of course, obviously they're not. They make very clear, just to quote from the social credit system policy document, they would call it a market improvement of the social and economic order. The idea is a more ordered society, which therefore does not necessarily mean a more free society. And so we have to come clean about the idea there are necessary differences between China and the so-called West. What if we're moving on the same track? What happens to so-called Western values then? Maybe we need to come a bit clearer about what those values need to be against this direction of travel, which we are just as exposed to as those living in China. That's where we end up in the book, that we, if you like.
Yeah, I think you once wrote, Naomi, that maybe the United States is becoming more like China and China is becoming more like the United States. And obviously, we need to be nuanced about that comparison. But I think what worries me is that in some respects, those differences are not that major, especially, for instance, when we think about deregulation. Both in the United States and in China, the state is very invested in getting out of the way of corporations, basically. So that's a similarity. In terms of the partnerships between states and corporations, I think we see very similar trends, which go back, if we think of colonialism, all the way to 500 years ago, where colonialism is very much a partnership between states and corporations. And so again, we see that in both places. And I think finally, just the deterioration of human rights in the sense that more authoritarian measures are put in place during times of emergency, and when we're told that this is being done for your safety. Again, I think we see correspondences between what happens in the United States and China.
I was glad that you presented on the requerimientos and that historical analogy. That was a real click moment for me when I read your journal article that was then expanded into the book. And there is a move right now from indigenous people around the world to call, for instance, there's the requerimientos, but there's various legal fictions that form the basis of settler colonial countries, right? That are basically just these fiats from the church, from the state, from various monarchs just going like, we declare this ours now and forever, And there is, as I was saying, there's movements from indigenous people calling on Pope Francis, who's said a lot of, he's made apologies for colonialism and so on, and they've said, well, if you mean it, rescind the papal bulls, and denounce manifest destiny and the doctrine of Christian discovery and all of this legal fiction. Now, the response to that is, well, it's too late. It's like 500 years too late. You have entire countries that are built on, we can now look at the requerimientos and say this is a legal absurdity to go into an indigenous village and read this in the middle of the night and say now we own the land. But so much has happened since, and so much violence and facts on the ground, as they say, right? But here we're talking about not 500 years, but in some cases 5 years. And one of my students asked a similar question, Eric. Maybe you can elaborate on this a bit. But what sort of push now or possibility is there to just question the legal basis on which this data has been expropriated when it's clearly so absurd, given that entire nations haven't been built, although many huge fortunes have been built?
Yes, I think recently it was rumored that Mexican President Manuel López Obrador demanded an apology from the Spanish government and the Pope for colonialism, and it didn't go down very well. I think he's still waiting for that apology. But you're right, there's this sense that, okay, this was so long ago, what can we do about it? I think what we're trying to do in our book is precisely this transhistorical comparisons to sort of argue that, in some ways, things haven't changed that much. I didn't get a chance during the presentation to explain, when I was talking about extermination, there was a legal document behind the slides, which was part of the Spanish legal compendiums regulating the operation of mines. And if you remember, in Latin America, these mines where the gold and silver was extracted were horrible places. The life expectancy was 4 years. So that women, men, and children who arrived to work at those mines would be dead within 4 years. And what's interesting about that legal document is that it says, oh, no, the mines are yours. It's saying to the indigenous American people. It's like, these are your mines, you could if you wanted to develop them. And it sort of reminded me of, when Mark Zuckerberg tells us, this is your data. You can do with it whatever you want. It's yours. I don't think he says that anymore. But it is these transhistorical comparisons, I think, that for us are very revealing.
And that does raise an interesting question about the legal debates right now. I mean, we greatly respect Tim Berners-Lee at the Web Foundation for his attempt to shift the debate and to encourage more data portability and so on and so forth. And we're sympathetic to that, but the problem is, if that's all we're going to do, the data transfer is already happening. We're already accepting ourselves as a domain of extraction. And what for us is missing in the debate around his proposals, the proposals from Microsoft and others that data are portable, and also the European legislation, which is a big step forward in many ways because it starts to raise human rights issues in the data domain. Again, if you look at that document, nowhere do they say certain types of data must never in principle be gathered. And for us, that's the seamfulness point. Maybe we have to start saying, you cannot be tracking me and whether I'm sweating or not. It's my body. You can't do that. Even if you can make profit, and even if you might persuade me, it might be to my advantage, you just can't do that sort of thing. And that's what's missing at the moment, and that sort of relates to your legal challenge. That's challenging the fiat, which is there in the data as the new oil, which is everywhere around us. That's what we have to start doing. And we haven't had that yet, and that's what we're trying to get going in the book.
Right, which would just say that these are not legitimate contracts, that there wasn't real consent. Yeah.
There's no consent, and it's the sort of thing in principle that corporations cannot be allowed to do.
I mean, this is partly why I was asking the question about the commons, because another model for how we should be thinking about data is that actually we built these social networks with our labor, with our tweets and our Facebook posts, and a lot of the discourse that was used in building them from these tech companies was a digital town square, a digital commons. So it seems like one route is own your own data, monetize your own data, make some Bitcoin from it. Another route is possibly saying, well, actually, maybe we should expropriate Facebook and own our own data collectively.
Well, Yevgeny Morozov has suggested something a bit like that, not with the practical detail, and that is an interesting way forward. The idea that where data is properly collected, and let's take the case of the city. We might all want traffic data to be gathered, we want various data for environmental purposes to be gathered, including about what we do ourselves in the environment to see that we're not messing up and not contributing to bad outcomes. We might agree that that can be commonly owned data on certain terms that are genuinely publicly negotiable, and we don't in any way rule that out in the book. The question is, those sort of cases where good purposes lead to good collection of data which is under good control are so rare in the bigger universe of data extraction that it would be naive to say, we think it would be naive to say that we can quickly scale up from there. We've got to first establish that's the better model and then say that should be a model for all forms of data use. But that means literally saying no to the model of corporate data extraction that's going on right now, which is everywhere. So it's a big shift that's got to go on. But it is an encouraging place to look, I think. Sorry.
Did you want to chime in on that?
Well, just quickly to say that there is an interesting conversation happening in terms of antitrust law and people arguing that, maybe these corporations are getting too big, maybe we should break them up. maybe they should function as public utilities where, we are part owners. But I guess the last point I would say is that at the end of the day, if we have a Fitbit that's open source and where we sort of are part owners of the company, the relationship that we are also developing with data and with monitoring ourselves, I think, those also go beyond just the question of who owns the actual company. So we're trying to think about that as well.
Great. Well, let's open it up. All the students in my class prepared questions as part of their weekly assignment. So I could put you on the spot, but I will also ask for volunteers to come up to the mic. Yeah, Eric? People can start lining up at the mic, and not just my class, anybody who feels like asking a question.
Hi. So Naomi actually sort of gave you my question, and so one that I actually thought of during the presentation was about when you were talking about the legal justifications for extraction and talking about how it was sort of terra nullius, and then they came in and started creating a legal definition of who gets to own this land. I sort of started to think about ICANN and the idea that the internet as a space does have one particular organization who has sort of set up the framework for who even gets to own space on the internet. And Zuboff talks in her book about the idea that, even though we're talking about data extraction as being a big deal in the modern economy, even back in the 90s, Google's initial business model was still about collecting data. From the beginnings of the internet, it's been about collecting data. And so I was wondering if you think that, there needs to be, if the internet needs to be unmade and rebuilt to address some of these things, that there can't just be one organization like ICANN that gets to determine the legal status of who gets to own space on the internet.
Well, I think Marx tried to make the point that, yes, the mode of production sort of determines what technologies you have available. And so if you change the mode of production, you also change the technologies. And so, of course, at this particular point in history, I don't think nobody is being as naive to think that tomorrow we can unthink capitalism. But yes, I think we can definitely unthink certain ways of thinking and certain rationalities, and perhaps prepare the grounds for, later having new kinds of technologies.
Yeah, you've raised a deep question there. And it's one we struggle with a lot, because it's why the book's called The Costs of Connection. Because obviously we're not saying connection in itself is bad. It's the basis of human sociality. It's what we have. On the other hand, on these terms, maybe the costs are too high and we need to shift the deal, if you like. Is the problem with the whole of the internet? I guess we don't think so in the end, because we argue we need to negotiate new ways of connecting. Maybe not forgetting what we've learned through social media, of course. A lot of joy and a lot of extraordinary activity is generated. We can't forget that. We should not forget that. But how, and this is where solidarity comes back, how can we help each other drop Facebook? How can we help each other become less dependent on certain platforms? Well, only by helping us deal with the costs of that and going back to ways of reorganizing things that didn't depend so much on this infrastructure, which are only 15, 20 years old. They're not so hard to recover in history. We're not talking 500 years this time. So that would still depend on an internet, but one that's not driven by the extraction of data, which therefore means, going back to the point about the commons, maybe we need to think seriously about a publicly funded, publicly resourced search engines, for example. Is that possible? Where will we start to think about that? That's another thing that might need to be on the table, so that the infrastructure is no longer just private. But it's a deep question you want. We could spend all afternoon on that question.
And you did mention that the idea of making internet like a public utility is also something that people talk about a lot, and I think that would play into that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So you mentioned that the emergence of resource appropriation is already more or less evident enough that it doesn't necessarily need a theoretical subjectivity notion. However, if you were to compare what observable discrepancies already exist between millennials and Gen Z how do you think they're directly influencing this sort of progression into a new form of late-stage capitalism? Or do you think that the notion that they'll probably lean already more towards decolonization is something that is directly impacting this sort of evidence?
That's a great question too, and maybe I can just sort of answer it anecdotally again, just from what I see in my classes, because it's true that, you know, I've been teaching about this almost 12 years, and I think at the beginning my students were less concerned with privacy and surveillance. It's like, I don't care if people take my data, I'm not doing anything wrong, and so, you know, that seemed to be kind of like the way of thinking. But recently, I've been encouraged to find that last couple of years, that discourse is starting to change. And without my prompting them too much, they're starting to ask questions. It's like, well, this isn't making sense. And, you know, how come this is set up this way? So I'm not sure that generationally we can make just a quick assessment about this generation being completely on board or, you know, or completely not on board. So it will be interesting to see what happens. But I think at each stage of history, we're going to have this tension and this conflict, and we will have to live to the fullest those contradictions and try to come up with a, you know, a model for living our own lives too.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. That was a great answer. I got nothing else to add to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, my name is Nala, and so I was trying to explain this concept to my little siblings. They're 5 years old, and I just started studying this myself, not like very recently. So as you guys said, it could be very confusing and shocking to a lot of people. And so when speaking to them, I was reflecting on the fact that while in high school and middle school, we got iPads for free, but they were heavily regulated. And we were obviously students who couldn't afford these pieces of technology. There were a whole bunch of apps we couldn't download. A lot of the apps that we could have were in partnership or sponsorship with the school that we went to. And so that kind of got me thinking about how could you teach kids and even their parents who may not really know about extraction and data colonialism, how could you teach that to kids without shocking them, especially when they might not even realize that their imagination and their creativity is literally being like sucked out of them?
That's such a good question. And I think education is a really fundamental space here, because it is in the book, we didn't bring it out in the talk, but this is one of the main domains of extraction today. The school is a tremendous business opportunity. I'm sure you're very familiar with all the platforms that are now selling pedagogic platforms in universities, in schools. It's happening in Britain and the States, not every country. Let's translate that into a different language, that the processes through which human beings become citizens, become fully aware human beings, that open process which is called education, is suddenly in itself a domain of extraction. You attach people early on to the machine. That's an extraordinarily violent thing that's going on in the education sector right now, and we're planning further articles about this. So, first of all, it will be necessary to shock people, to tell them this is the game in education, but at the same time, we have to go back to imagination, as you say. And I think the notion of freedom is really important here, even though it may be difficult to recover. And to tell people about other notions of freedom, and that being tracked, having someone in between you and your conscience, is not the way we've understood freedom. Even in the most repressive religions, they still depend on a certain notion of religious freedom. We have a different view on how much time we have to intervene in this debate. My simple way of putting it, if you look at the kids of 2 or 3 are now growing up with toys that are robots, with machine learning built into them that listen to their language and play back their words to help with their language, that kids are growing up thinking that the most free space, the space in which they play, we all think back to our childhood when we could just play, will already have been tracked spaces. I often ask colleagues who are younger than me, in 20 years' time, how are you going to convince your students that freedom from surveillance still matters? And I do not know the answer unless we start resisting. unless we start calling this out. So you've asked an unanswerable question.
I have a
The answer is we have to start resisting, because otherwise you're going to be right and it will not be possible to challenge people in 10 years' time. We have 10 years, maybe less, maybe a bit more, to get this message across. Not quite as urgent as the global catastrophe, in which action is required immediately, but pretty urgent. Pretty urgent.
Hi, I'm Leah. Thanks for coming today. So my question kind of goes off of the end of hers. In terms of rejecting the rationality behind data colonialism, how would you imagine a social movement to come forth that would call for change in this age of technological ubiquity, when a lot of the social movements today are dependent on social media to raise awareness and organize? But meanwhile, they're also tracking us and profiting from our use.
And that's something that comes up, and you quote Leanne Simpson, who came and visited and spoke last semester, describing the tensions of being part of. Leanne Simpson is an Indigenous writer and organizer in Canada, Anishinaabe, who was one of the key voices of the movement Idle No More, which is an Indigenous rights movement that started in Canada and went global. And Leanne talked about sort of a moment of realization where she realized that this was this sort of huge anti-colonial uprising that was all happening on platforms that were owned by a handful of white men who were getting very rich off of it. But she, more than that, was talking about how she felt that it shaped the movement itself and created, well, the way she describes it, that there was connection, that were connections that were unearned in relationships, that the work of trust building and relationship building had not been done, and you had this like explosion of connection with like kind of in a very ephemeral and vulnerable way. And she has since left social media, from what I can tell.
Yeah, I would just say that I would hope to see not just one social movement, but many different ones of very different colors and shapes. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. And maybe some of those we won't particularly agree with or like, but that's okay. I think a Muslim cleric in Indonesia a couple of years ago said, well, taking selfies is haram, you know, a sin. And I'm not sure that all of us are going to identify or be able to follow that. He himself was kind of ridiculed. But, you know, I think we're going to see different approaches and different proposals, and we just need to allow for that to happen.
Yeah, and in a sense, the social movements that need to build have to be, you know, reflective about how they're using these technologies. Not to use them at all, it's obviously not a start if you're trying to get things going on scale, we know that. But that doesn't mean to say that the key thing to reflect upon is, what is this doing to us as we use this? We're great admirers of Leanne Simpson's book. Writing is fantastic, and she's got a great phrase in her book, productive place of refusal, I think is the phrase. The idea that while refusing, it has to be productive. Just saying no is not enough. Acting no, acting on a different basis. That's a complicated idea that we can only do together. We have to help each other think what will be a productive way of refusing, which obviously does not mean immediately dropping all social media so no one can hear us at the beginning, but it goes on being reflexive, and there's so much to draw on in her book in terms of her reflections, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Cameron. I'm also in Professor Klein's class. So my question would be around, so I've noticed that like one of the major ways that like surveillance capitalists and data colonialists and big tech giants kind of get us to buy into and agree to their terms of service is like offering us conveniences in exchange. So like the example that I used when I was writing the question was how Netflix's algorithms base like how they recommend TV shows and movies to us off of the data from stuff we've already watched. So my question would be, and I'm gonna look at my note here, is it possible to retain these conveniences of social quantification without our personal data and our personal lives being commodified and capitalized on, or is that in and of itself like naturally exploitative?
It's a good question. Some people have been working on this. I can't recall the details right now, but there was a guy at the Berkman Center last year who was trying to develop small communities where people would agree to share their data so they get better options, let's say around books or whatever, on terms they controlled and understood and so on. And also so that the data was collected and generated, the choices, was on the device itself. Device-only extraction, so that it didn't go into a bigger pool for wider manipulation. And given that we all do want to choose the right books and fruit restaurants and so on, that could be a way, the device-only approach to that particular problem. So we're not saying that personalization is necessarily bad, and that's indeed the power of the ideology. Who doesn't want personalized services? The problem is when it comes with personalized surveillance. That's the secret deal that's not so attractive, but it's necessary. So it's a good point. There may be some solutions there. Yeah.
Great. Did you have a question?
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
Sorry, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We were talking about how these things socialize us and how dangerous this kind of data mining and this changing cultural consciousness to only the market space is. And I couldn't help but notice when people were asking questions, well, how do we use social media without being consumed by it? I mean, at what point is violent action necessary or justified, especially in the case of indigenous people? And when you add to the fact that a lot of these legalities or legal absurdities, they exist only to perpetuate this idea that we know to be false. I mean, do you think that at some point using violence either against like state security apparatus or individual bad actors is going to become inevitable if we want to stop this process?
Well, I mean, if you look at decolonial struggles, they were certainly not always pacifist struggles. And if you look, for instance, at the works of Frantz Fanon that I mentioned in my talk too, yes, he definitely acknowledged that violence plays a role in the process of decolonization. Of course, we're not necessarily advocating blindly just, violence, but I think people will always be pushed only to certain extents. And I think if you look at what's happening right now in Hong Kong and what's happening with the yellow vests in France, violence is always, I think, going to be part of a particular kind of approach. And especially when you think about the colonial struggles, I think it's too easy to just disown that or to condemn it as, violence is bad. So it's all about the context, I think.
But just briefly in one sentence, the sort of violence that's digital, so distributed denial of service, hacking, is potentially a very important tool here. And the problem is it's very hard to control the collateral damage when you do that because precisely we're in a connected system. That's the difficulty. If you scale up hacking, what happens to electricity grids and so on and so forth. That's a very difficult terrain. So we don't pursue it any further, but I mean, it's a very good question. So thanks for that.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are pretty much out of time. I just want to ask one final point, which was raised by one of my students, Jacqueline, which has to do with, I think part of what's difficult around this discussion is we're talking about foreclosing possibilities that maybe are difficult to imagine if you're already within the matrix. So when you think about the ways in which people's behavior is being modified, behavior is being shaped, right? So it's not just about watching, but it's also about directing people towards certain behaviors or foreclosing on certain behaviors. What sort of tangibly can you point to about what are you seeing disappear, I guess? I'm paraphrasing, but I'll just read you this question. What data do you have about how consumer data is being utilized today to support your conclusion that data colonialism threatens one's capacity for change and transformation, right?
Well, we're at the early stages of this transformation, so we'll be come quite clean with you. This book is a warning shot. We're not saying that everything we're talking about has already fully happened. We're saying there's lots of evidence in business commentary, in all the underlying documents in marketing, whatever. So this is a plan of action. This isn't a strategy. So we're calling it out and imagining it continuing without resistance for 5 or 10 years. So right now, things are not yet fully realized. But then I think that's again where solidarity comes back to look. The consumer space is slightly more difficult because maybe we don't care so much if some of our consumer choices are nudged in this direction or another. Where we start definitely to care is where that data about our consumer choices is mixed with other data in a totally different context, say a work context, a social context, to reach other results. This is where seamfulness comes back in. It's the bringing one pile of data in connection with another. That's where the larger damage is done. Now, we do see plenty of cases where excluded populations become more profoundly excluded because of the way their data is used against them. And there are plenty of examples of that in relation to minorities already, or people who can't get back into the workplace. So that's where I would start. The consumer space is difficult because it seems a free, happy space of just doing what we want to do. But it isn't, so unconnected from the rest.
Yeah, I think what's really important about your question is this notion of, is there even an outside? A space to stand outside. And I think colonialism was always such a totalizing system, which doesn't mean resistance couldn't be possible. It's just that, you know, it permeated everything of both the external and the internal world. And in my earlier work, I actually come up with the notion of the paranodal. Basically the space that we don't see in networks. I think when we've visualize a network, we see the dots and we see the lines, but we don't see the space that is empty or dead. And I argue that that space is never empty. That space is never dead. It is actually occupied by things that do not conform to the logic of the network. And I think that search for those conceptual spaces is going to be very important over the next couple of decades.
Absolutely, and I feel tremendously grateful to both of you for providing us with this intellectual framework, which I think is going to be taken up for many years to come. Thank you all for being here. Keep in mind that things are changing quickly. We are seeing all kinds of new forms of resistance within tech companies, outside of tech companies. Think about Amazon's failed attempt to come to New York City. So it can seem as if it is totalizing, but if we step back a little and see how much perception of these companies has changed just in the past 2 years, it's really quite remarkable. Thank you again. Our guests are going to be here. Their books, unfortunately, were supposed to be for sale, are not physically here, but you can still, I think, get them if you want, or get them signed, or get a slip signed. We've got a plan. All right. So I don't think you have to run right away, right?
No,
so, okay, if people want to mill a bit. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.